Welcome to this Lunch and Learn event on supply chain resilience. The next sort of 40 minutes, we're going to talk to you at a high level about the steps that your organisation can be taking, should be taking to address supply chain resilience, both for your own organisation, but also as part of a larger supply chain that you're possibly working in. We're looking to aim for about 40 minutes with a 5-minute questions and answer session. So please feel free to sort of ask any questions and put them in the chat box, and I'll keep my eye on those as we're going through. As you are probably familiar with all our events, it's important that we get your feedback. So what Sophie will be doing throughout this session is putting a link to the feedback form. We strongly lead with you to make sure that you do complete that, because these events only get as good as the feedback that you provide us, so we can try and improve them as we go along. So please feel free to do that. So what are we covering today? How are we going to go through this over your lunch? We have a number of areas that we're going to be looking at. So we'll start off with a quick introduction. I recognise some names on my little screen, others I don't, so I'll give you a bit of an overview of who I am. We'll have a look at why we're here. Nothing big and philosophical, I promise you, but actually what's the current situation? Why is resilience so important? And then actually, for those of you who do know me and know that my background is procurement, why supply chains are so important and why procurement is now becoming incredibly important, or it has been, but even more important for the resilience of our organisations and the resilience of our supply chains. We're going to have a quick overview of what your response might have looked like over the last sort of 4 months or however long we've been in lockdown, and what the sort of business activities are that you could have been doing and should be doing. But then actually what we're looking to do is discover how to bring resilience into your organisation and think about the future. So if anybody's got a crystal ball and can contribute, please do. But fundamentally, what does this future look like? And then we'll have a quick overview in terms of some key things that you could be thinking about as for Action Sustainability. We are the delivery partner of the Sustainability School, hence why you'll see the AS brand right now rather than necessarily the school brand. We do a lot of delivery for the school. I do a lot of training for the school. I currently lead on sustainable procurement, and I also lead on modern slavery. I always hate saying that, not doing modern slavery, but trying to combat it, and a lot of people issues within the school. I also have the same remit within the consultancy division, within AS's division, which is where we tend to operate. And my background is procurement, has been since I left university a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. And I also have been in construction probably for about 20 years, a long time ago. I used to work brilliant before I joined AS. So vague understanding, predominantly infrastructure in terms of background. So hopefully if you can take anything away, we're looking at trying to help you understand the business resilience planning process, understand why resilience is so important to your organisation, understand the sorts of things that you need to be looking at, understanding the importance of procurement and supply chains, regardless of the size of your organisation, and understand the sorts of key things that you could put into some sort of action planning process. Let's go into why we're here, the current picture. There's this been thing going on, I know you're probably all familiar with it, the COVID-19, and it has caused a lot of issues. But actually what it's also done is shine a spotlight on a lot of organisational issues that potentially have always been there. We're not averse to crises in our supply chain or crises in our supply chains and our organisations, and I think you could probably replace COVID-19 with Brexit. That was probably the thing just before this that was starting to panic us. Now we have COVID to overlay to that. If you're like me, the little man on the question mark at the top is what the heck's going on right now. I ran a session like this probably about 4 months ago where we were in lockdown. It was clear, we knew what was going on, but we're now coming out of it and it's not particularly clear where we're going and the direction that we're doing. So the environment that we're operating in now is trying our understanding of organisational processes extensively. And yes, the seal is exactly how I feel every morning. It's trying to get some clarity over what we're doing within these spaces. Hopefully you haven't all decided to sell toilet rolls. I might be sitting on a few of them, but we have obviously had huge supply issues, and you can place that picture of toilet rolls with PPE. We've seen lots of scandals recently over the resilience of our supply chain and PPE within the NHS. And being a baker in my part-time, flour and basic necessities have started to disappear. And how we've been able to get hold of those is really important. Businesses are slowly awakening, but still not awakening to the new environment. We are still getting into this environment of how do we adapt and make our business more resilient and adapt to what we're now calling the cliche comment, but the new normal. And the bottom right-hand corner one is if you're anything like me and a parent trying to teach kids while working, I'm really looking forward to September. I don't know about anybody else, and taking my children back to school. But we've had the added challenge of how we improve our productivity. And in fact, this morning I just actually read somewhere in one of the newspapers that businesses have been operating potentially on a 3-day week, where they have been operating whilst individuals try and learn how to juggle reduced staff levels and homeschooling and everything else. So we are dealing with a really difficult climate in which to operate. Now, it depends on your perspective of life. It also depends for me personally what I feel like when I get out of bed in the morning. But there are 2 different ways to look at this current environment. And in fact, we've seen this replicated a lot with businesses. There are those that are the half-empty field. It's a very nerve-wracking expression. We know now that we are going to be heading for a recession of some description, and the budget yesterday started to show that the government's trying to alleviate some of that, but it's coming. We are lucky that in construction there does seem to be some commitment to delivering on a lot of programs that are out there. So construction potentially may be hit, but it may not be hit as badly as we hope. I don't know if anybody's been seeing a lot of the stories recently, but we have massive challenges to the way that our businesses are operating. So if you've been only looking at the newspapers, exploitation, bad practices, bad behaviour, this is shining a light on all of this sort of issue right now. And people can actually focus on that. The way that we feel in terms of our organisations, the uncertainty obviously provides a lot of our workforce, this issue of fear and uncertainty in the way we operate. And the fact that businesses are really struggling with the fact that they can't operate normally. You can't operate normally, and even coming out of lockdown, we can't. So this obviously puts us under a lot of pressure. And some people have got too much time on their hands. I know a lot of people who don't, but there are some that sort of sit there and say they have too much time. But if you're half full, there are ways that we can take this as a positive. So actually, I have seen lots and lots of businesses thinking about the way they operate, thinking about becoming more efficient. And it's actually quite kudos to our industry in terms of construction that I've spoken to some supply chain directors who've talked about the fact that they've been able to get up and running very quickly, have put the new processes in place, have been able to adapt and work with their supply chains really effectively. So I think it's a good testament to the way that our industry tends to operate. We're actually working in an environment of collaboration and support. And in fact, our industry has been doing that for a while now, but it's really come to the fore, I think, in terms of being able to help suppliers, being able to help some organisations further down the supply chain. And I've heard some really good stories of where clients are trying to help some of the smaller organisations with payment terms and with actually ensuring that payments get to them on time. And yes, no sarcasm in the room, because I know that doesn't always happen. But there's also individuals, businesses that can see ways to get to new markets, to think about new outlets for their products and new ways of doing things. So it can provide a really, really good opportunity. And one thing that we have to sort of say, it may not have been clear all the time, but support has been made available pretty much throughout this, whether it's come from government, whether it's come from industry. And yes, it's not been seamless, but there's definitely been some opportunities there for businesses to get help. And obviously with the budget yesterday, more is coming. The key though is that the way we are right now is that we need to be learning to adapt. Now it's kind of interesting because this adage, the learn to adapt piece, is not new. We as businesses always have to learn to adapt. Environments change regularly. And that's why the idea of resilience and actually the sort of risk adaptation, all those sorts of elements are so important continuously, not just now for COVID, but you'll have been doing it for Brexit. You're probably going to need to be doing it again for COVID Mark II and Brexit Mark II in terms of whether we leave Europe with an agreement or not at the end of this year. As businesses, you are continually needing to adapt. This obviously has put us into sharper focus, but fundamentally we do need as organisations to be continually adapting to the environment in which we operate. So why has the focus been so much recently on supply chains? Why are supply chains so important? I don't know about you, well I do, I know you've probably been on loads and loads of webinars, munching your lunch while you're actually sitting there watching people talk at you. And I went to a very interesting one recently where somebody talked about the fact that competition is no longer between organisations, but between supply chains. Within construction, particularly as our industry, we are very, very much reliant on better integrated, better collaborative supply chains. And there's some really good examples, particularly in infrastructure, the sector that I've spent most of my construction life in, where collaboration is bringing in some really good results, both from cost savings, from efficiencies, from just working better on some of the projects. So it's important to understand that every organisation, regardless of what size they are part of this chain. And the risk of sounding very cliched, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. So actually it's really important that as organisations we start to make sure that our resilience strategies, that we are adapting those as much as possible, and that actually we understand our position in the supply chain and actually the importance of procurement to enable us to do that. So we talk a lot about sort of resilient supply chains, but a way of us being able to do that is to also look at things like our procurement activities. There is always a bit of a grey area between what is supply chain management and what is procurement. Procurement, if you look at the SIPS definition, is about the tactical, I'm going to buy some stuff or I'm going to get some services. And it's about making sure that obviously, whether it's internal or whether it's from third parties, you're getting those for best value, best price, whatever your criteria happens to be. The supply chain management, however, is something that's quite important in construction as an industry, but it is possibly one of the areas that we're not very good at. And it's actually about overseeing how all those different procurement entities, those products, those services are linked in, and actually how we work closer with a lot of our suppliers and our supply chain organisations to run those efficiencies, to do things better. And in fact, through the school at the moment, we're working on a range of modules and training materials on how to procure better, regardless of your size, and how to do supply chain management. And it's a kind of sad indictment that we're starting to see not enough examples of really good supply chain management where we need them in this industry. The reality is that as organisations, if you're looking at resilience in your supply chain, if you're looking to ensure that you are being able to adapt to the environment, you need processes and systems for both. But that doesn't necessarily mean they have to be the same. As SMEs, it could be something small and informal, but you may actually be doing a lot of good supply chain management without realising it. Or obviously, as you get to larger organisations, those systems become more complex. But the idea is that you need a good system to procure and you need a good system to manage your supply chain if you want to understand how to become resilient and be flexible through time. So why do we think procurement and supply chain management are important? Well, we've only seen today, in fact you can see it every day, globalization is not going away, but the spotlight's even more now on where we're getting things from, the transparency and supply chain pieces. Technology management is becoming more and more important. How we connect each link in our supply chain is becoming really, really important. So, process of invoices, how do we do this in a really slick way? Right now, to avoid the transmission of COVID, organisations talking about, could we move to sort of paperless environments to allow us to do this? Better planning, better communications, virtual events, whatever they happen to be. One of the really interesting things as well, in terms of how the supply chains need to adapt going forward, is the fact that sustainability and CSR requirements are not going away. In the last recession in 2008, I remember I had a lot of time to tap my fingers on a desk because after the recession, everybody said that sustainability was a nice to have and CSR was a nice to have. But right now, everybody is looking at the build back better, whatever the phrase people are using for the resets, as being fundamentally important, but also fundamentally important to include those aspects like carbon reduction, like better people management, like training and skills. They are not going away. So procurement and supply chains are fundamentally important to that. Procurement cost reduction 101, we do need to reduce our costs. A recession is coming. There will need to be ways that we can be more efficient, but actually innovation is also becoming a really important part. We're in unprecedented times. I think I'm going to play cliche bingo, seriously. Unprecedented times. We're in areas where things aren't normal and will not be normal probably for a reasonable period of time. And as I've said, competition now is between those really strong and robust and flexible supply chains of which all your organisations are part of. So regardless of whether you're a large or a small organisation, procurement has advantages. For those small organisations on this call, don't think the big organisations have got it down pat and understand them themselves, because they don't necessarily always. But fundamentally, procurement and supply chain strategies can help any organisation of any size look at a number of areas. So reducing cost, procurement 101, reducing down those costs. And I'm talking about cost, which also includes value in there as well. Increasing efficiency. A lot of the issues that I see both in my sustainable procurement arena and in procurement arena come because there are bad planning processes that have come from not working with a decent procurement or supply chain strategy. You can increase your output, work more collaboratively, more innovatively. You can increase your profit, and obviously, you can see potential for growth and diversification. A great example of this was one organisation that I spoke to, an SMEs who were looking at, they did roofing. This is before COVID. They did roofing. They've actually used things like the apprenticeship levy to retrain their guys to install solar panels. So actually now they do solar panels and roofing. They've diversified into different areas. So procurements and supply chain strategies, understanding what the market is doing, is a really good advantage regardless of the size of your business. It's just about proportional response. So how have you all been responding? What have you all been thinking about? There was a really good diagram that I saw a while ago, which really started to illustrate the 4 phases of what supply chain responses should look like. And this was created by EcoVadis in a webinar that I attended of theirs. And they managed to articulate this really, really well. So the first stage we're in right now, probably coming out the tail end now, we've been reacting. And we're still reacting to a certain point, but we're now into this phase where we need to think about this resilience. We're starting to get a bit clearer in terms of where things are, what we should be doing, and actually starting to think about actually how do we manage some of these risk trade-offs, and how do we start to think about what that new normal might look like within that environment into that rebound and new normal phase. What's actually been able to do within this space, though, is actually look at CLC's version, which is very, very similar. So if you're not familiar with this, the Construction Leadership Council have created their roadmap to recovery, which works on a very, very similar principle with those 3 aspects, if you like. So there's the restart, reset, and reinvent elements that they're looking at, which is the restart, just trying to get everybody back to work, trying to get the contracts in. The reset, looking to actually then start to think about how we drive that demand through our supply chain. So if anybody's connected into the HS2, for example, brilliant work being done at the moment through HS2's Innovation Hub, looking at how you can actually drive some of that demand and ideas into the supply chain, increase productivity, and then build that capability in the supply chain. And right now as organisations, you've got an amazing chance to learn absolutely everything, because you're probably inundated every day with at least 50 new webinars that you can learn so much about. So strengthening that capability, everybody's really keen to do. But then also look at ways that you can reinvent. And as a business, if you're looking at that resilience and in the supply chain resilience, focusing on that reinvent piece is really important. So how can you look at that better value? How can you come out of this being slightly better and providing a stronger link in that supply chain? So from a reactionary perspective, some of these may look familiar. You've probably been looking at utilising any stock reserves. And I did hear somebody recently say, thank God for Brexit, because if we hadn't had Brexit, I wouldn't have any stock. So they may now potentially have been gone, but you've probably been utilising as much stock as you possibly can get. I've heard of shortages of bricks and dry lining materials, a huge range of different sorts of materials that started to disappear. And you might now be thinking where you're going to be getting your next consignments from. You may have been buying from anywhere. And for those of you who are familiar with me and the work I do, will know that I've talked a lot about the PPE scandals in the NHS. They've bought their PPE from absolutely anywhere and have therefore ended up buying them from areas where they've been importing sweatshop PPE in Malaysia and those sorts of countries. So you don't care where you're getting from, you just buy it. You may have stopped work, you may have furloughed staff and be thinking about how you're going to get your stuff back. And you may now be comfortable roughly with the sorts of operational procedures you could be doing, but obviously have one eye permanently on the advice and guidance the government is looking for. And you've probably been really hard and fast looking after the welfare of your staff, whether it's those being furloughed. I've seen some really good examples of it, and I've seen some areas where it's not been done so well. But understanding how to look after your staff, and keep them fit, healthy and engaged. So that's probably where you are. You might still be there. You might actually be coming out the tail end of that. And you might now be thinking about how you can get into that resilience phase. So now I think we're quite close as organisations to think about how we start adjusting our strategies and looking at this sort of short-term risk management. We know that there is a new normal that will change. It's not a consistent new normal. It will continually evolve over time as we get to grips with understanding what this disease can do, and obviously as we get to grips with other external impacts like things like Brexit, like who our trade deals are going to be with. And the idea is that we can take this opportunity now to look at things like resilience and rebounding, looking at how we make our businesses smarter and better. And some of that process isn't always about how many people we lay off. In the last recession in 2008, I saw a statistic that basically said that only something like 2/3 of businesses interviewed dealt with the recession by actually laying off staff and screwing their supplier for the cheapest price. And you may have been at the tail end of some of that response. Right now, we need more businesses to do the bit that 1/3 of them did, which is look about how you adapt your business in your organisational processes, how you become smarter and more efficient and more flexible to go forward. Because that's the bit that will actually deliver you a more resilient supply chain going forward. So in terms of resilience, there's a different way to describe it. So it's an organisation's ability to proactively plan and design the supply chain where you can anticipate unexpected disruptive and negative effects. It's also about the ability to return quickly to a previously good condition after problems. So there's a number of things that we'll go through over the next 10 minutes or so that can give you an idea of the sorts of things that you could be building into your resilience strategy. There's cash and materials planning. You're probably already doing that. How can I keep my cash? How can I take advantage of all the different government systems that are out there, the schemes that they're trying to pump into businesses? How can I actually look at making sure my materials work for me? How am I making sure that my business is operating properly and that I've got the right operational review? And from that, I mean, not just the emergency response, but actually future responses. How are you looking at your supply chain sources? How are you dealing with the relationships? How are you looking at things like digitization? And are you doing any scenario planning and risk and opportunity planning? So if we take each of these in sort of isolation, the cash and materials planning is really, really important, and probably the thing that you're looking at the most right now. So where do you need to invest? What is the marketplace telling you? What are clients asking you to look for? Where do you think that future demand? And as I said, I think we're quite lucky at the moment in construction, but there does seem to be a big push to try and make sure that the industry actually can deliver, particularly on government funded projects, can deliver on a lot of the requirements going forward. We just get to see if they're going to bring in the value equation. It's stock an issue. So, you know, if we are going to ramp up a lot of these projects, if construction is going to be really going hell for leather over the next couple of years trying to catch up, do we know where our stock is coming from? Do we have any potential issues going forward? And to help us with that, are we thinking about our demand planning? And again, all organisations can do this regardless of the size. It doesn't have to be big and comprehensive. It can be smaller, but you've got to understand what your future demand looks like to enable you to start having those conversations with the supply chain around you, so that you can get hold of some of that stock if you need it, or work more collaboratively maybe with some of your peers to identify what to look at. Payment terms, the old adage in any procurement activity in any supply chain is, are they an issue? Right now, I think you've got a better opportunity than ever to speak to clients if payment terms are either hurting or they're not being upheld properly and the cash flow is not coming through to your business. Clients are more and more interested in listening to you and helping you in those situations. And then obviously thinking about all these advantages of government schemes. I did see this morning, literally hot off the press, the Construction Leadership Council's announcement on their retention plan on trying to keep people employed within industry, and obviously how you can access all the different types of grants that the government is looking for. So look into that. It's worth having that sort of investment decision. Obviously, look at your operational review. It sounds kind of perverse, but there is a saying that says, don't let a good crisis go to waste. So from a perspective of this, it's been so unique, and there are so many amazing, really good examples of what people have done within this space. So understand what's worked well, understand what you've had to adapt, understand what guidelines are in place, and obviously, has this been able to get you to think about offering things slightly differently? You know, did you offer products? Can you now offer services? Are there opportunities for you to provide new product that happens to be out there? I saw an amazing story of one couple who just basically set a hand sanitizing business. They produced it on a small scale usually, and have managed to get significant increases in business, because obviously right now that's what's needed. So understand where your business sits currently within that element and where it sits in that supply chain, so that you can make sure that your operational review develops those businesses going forward. You also need to think about your supply chain sources. Obviously, organisations of different sizes have different capacity within this space. Some of the larger organisations have a team of people, although some of the larger organisations I know still don't have enough people to do this process going forward. But understand where your products and services are coming from if you're providing them to a client, because if you cannot source them, if you can't manage them effectively, you are going to provide a weaker link in that supply chain. So are you a risk to supply, or are your suppliers a risk to your supply? Do you get your products internationally? And it's about starting to ask those conversations. You may know, you may not know, but there's been a phrase that's been bandied around for the last few years with modern slavery over its head, that's now come really to the top of a lot of people's conversation piece, but not for modern slavery, but for sourcing issues. So transparency in supply chains. Do you know where things are coming from? Have you had those conversations? Do you know where your shortages are? And most people do. Most people know a lot more than they think they do. Can you get multiple sources? So have you always gone to traditional organisations? Could you go and find somebody different to make sure that supply carries on? And this is a situation where you could be working with other organisations, working with clients to understand what's going on in the marketplace, understanding what the current capacity is for any products and services that you're looking for. And thinking about different types of models. If there are issues that you think are going to cause you a problem, look at the types of contracts you put in place, look at the sorts of conditions, look at the sort of models that you use, so collaboration, making sure that you can get that surety of supply going forward. And if you don't have any intelligence on the marketplace, understand where you can get it from. So again, I'm a massive, massive advocate of all the chains talking to each other in supply chains, talking to your clients, talking to your peers, talking to other organisations. You're all in a very similar situation here. So trying to understand where you can get that from. Don't be souped into thinking that price is the only thing to worry about. Price is obviously going to be really, really scrutinised, but it's not the only factor. Right now, it might even be worth paying a little bit more to make sure that you can get that reliability, that you can get the quality. And obviously legality is something that we sort of take for granted, but more and more we're starting to see examples where people have just not really paid that much attention to whether things are legal and compliant, and are now starting to get stung from it. And as I said, transparency was important pre-COVID. That hasn't changed, and that conversation's actually come further up the conversation dinner table. So in terms of relationship management, have a think about who your stakeholders are. And again, these may all sound big, complex projects to do, but again, depending on the size of your organisation and where you are, you will be doing these in a variety of different ways anyway. So who are you having conversations with on a formal or informal basis? Obviously, the larger you are, the more people you will have having those conversations. But develop an approach to engaging with those stakeholders. I was going to say the pubs are open, if not for pints, or don't. But think about the way that you engage with them and the sorts of information that they need. Are they sort of pointing you to various areas of sources of information that can help you? But the key here is the honesty. Be open, honest and transparent. Right now, everybody needs to understand how the supply chain is operating, where there are problems, where there are issues. So you aren't penalised, particularly if you're working with a really good client, for working in an environment where you're having issues. People are more interested now in helping to make sure that that supply chain stays robust. So we have this period of collaboration and support. If you do have some organisations that are negative and disadvantageous and aren't going the way you want, now is the time to start using these sort of stakeholder evaluations to determine whether they're right for you right now. Use technology. There's so much information out there. There's Zoom calls. I mean, you can talk to more people now than you've ever been able to speak to. So use that as much as possible and harness this sort of peer-to-peer and business relationships to understand what's going on, what the landscape looks like. Then I suppose the final couple of areas to have a think about are things like digitalisation or digitisation. So financial transactions, communication tools, Zoom, Teams, there are so many out there now. I was having a conversation this morning with my boss about, new normal, whether people are going to reject them and kick back and say they never want to attend another webinar again. She says, hopefully not everyone's thinking that right now. And so looking at things like those tools is really important. Even though we will be comfortable and wanting to go back to face-to-face eventually, they still have brought lots of efficiencies into the way that we operate as businesses. Look at things like ERP, MRP systems, material resource planning, those sorts of tools that are available. Again, they sound big and complex, but as an SME, you can still get access to these at a reasonable price, and they can help you with things like your materials planning. In construction, we've never really been that good at this, not holistically, but actually these sorts of things are now becoming more and more important as we understand the sorts of projects that we need to be delivering on. Think about new technology. There's a whole range out there, so I strongly recommend, if you've not done it yet, go to the school and have a look at a lot of the resources around off-site, a lot of the work that's going in there about digitisation, about the new way of working. And if you're working in infrastructure, big clients at the moment, like the Highways England, like the HS2s, like Network Wales, are all really keen on how we do more with the technology available. It's the way we're going to attract more and more people into our industry. And don't neglect the training and development. I mean, we are looking at the way that the government is pushing a lot of the funding. So it does seem to be about job retention, about training. I mean, CITV have pulled a lot of the services that they have, but they're still really, really important, pushing the apprenticeship roles and ensuring that we've still got the next generation coming through. And now more than ever, you can train lots of people with very little time commitment, no travelling, you've got virtual pretty much at your doorstep. And then think about the ultimate resilience, the what if scenario. What happens if we end up with a second lockdown? What happens if you're sitting in Leicester right now with that lockdown, Anglesey, where they're potentially looking at another lockdown? Where are you geographically located, and what would happen if suddenly there was a lockdown stopping you working? What can you do in terms of your business to keep it running and running effectively? So what are those risks to your organisation? And when I say this, use it as an opportunity to think about the bigger risks, not just what COVID is looking at, but actually look at the big risks that are coming in. You've got more to a certain extent than you think. COVID is obviously the biggest one on our doorstep. I've already mentioned Brexit, God knows how many times. That is another one that's coming in terms of whether there's a deal or no deal. You've also got issues like the climate change emergency. You've got issues like increased taxes coming through in areas where air quality is poor. So there are a lot of areas, at the risk of sounding very doom and gloom, that you need to be thinking about managing in terms of that resilient planning. So the social, the economic and the environmental pieces are still really, really important, and will need to form part of that holistic thinking in your organisation. But then when you're thinking about that resilience and when you're thinking about that risk, don't forget to not always be in the glass half full, half empty, look at the half full too. So there are potential opportunities in there. How can you turn that round to take your business on to the next level, or improve, or just get smarter at stuff? And what's worked well? How have you innovated? And what opportunity have you got to influence either your clients, the stakeholders, talk to other peer organisations? But right now, get all your organisational people together, depending on the size of your business, obviously. But you need to think about as many people being involved in that risk. So ops, finance, your procurement teams. Supply chain resilience isn't just about procurement. It's about how, as an organisation, you sit in that supply chain. And the organisation is made up of more than just some people who buy things. So it's important to make sure that you get all those relevant individuals involved. Fundamentally, what this is trying to do is get you to be seen as, to your clients, as an organisation that can be flexible, that can adapt, that is not so worried about absolutely everything that you become immobile, that you can be flexible in the environment that we're operating in. The beauty in all of this is that I would say to anybody is that there is no right answer. And I've had a number of roundtable events with partners from the school and with other organisations who've all sat down just to share ideas. That was a really good idea. That was a good idea. We could have done this, or we could have talked to our staff properly, or we could have looked at opportunities to try different routes to market, these sorts of things. But right now you've got a really good opportunity to think about how you can become flexible. Because what you're looking to do is position yourself in a supply chain where you're helping your clients deliver on their needs. And what a client is looking for fundamentally in its supply chain are its suppliers to have surety of supply, to have that resilience, to be legal and to not import any risk, whether it be around human rights, whether it be around employment conditions, whether it be about dodgy goods that you're buying from various places. Don't lose sight of that legality piece. To be flexible and open and admit that you might need some support, or actually speak to your client about the fact that you may have some ideas that could support them around that collaboration piece, and the honesty. I don't mean that to sound very tree huggy, but fundamentally it is about being a supplier that's seen as being adaptive and honest and looking to try and get that supply chain delivering something in its whole entirety rather than just out for themselves. So for the last minute or so, a few things I think if you were going to go away and put an action plan together and the sorts of questions that you need to ask, a couple of immediate things that you could take away. Undertake your scenario planning. What happens if lockdown hits? What happens if a lot of those other issues are going out there? Don't overlook the opportunity to just keep that continuous improvement loop going. What's worked in your lockdown? What's working going forward? Consider things like your supply chain strategy, and that might sound big and comprehensive, but fundamentally you're all part of a supply chain where you'll all have your own types of strategy. Where, are the weaknesses in your supply? Talk. Not just to clients, but to peers, to other organisations. You are already coming to lots of webinars, I have no doubt, but try and cherry pick little bits and bobs from them all so that you can learn to and adapt. But fundamentally, don't forget that actually within our industry, the strongest resource we have is our people, and the fact that the resilience comes from resilient people. So fundamentally, look after yourselves and look after the people that you're connected to, because if we're all pretty much strong and resilient going forward, then we've got more opportunity to adapt going forward. So, my God, I've actually hit that 40 minutes. So that's sort of a quick overview, a high level, as much as I can give you in 40 minutes on the sort of resilience issues. There are loads and little cherry-picked items in there that you go onto the supply chain school, there will be workshops and elements about. So for example, the transparency one, we're running a transparency in the supply chain workshop. So that isn't me just talking at you, I promise, but that's actually us talking to you about how you do that transparency, how you do that mapping, how you do that risk assessment. We've got lots of sessions that we're going to be running over what good procurement processes look like, and eventually at the end of this year running stuff on supplier relationship management. So if you want to have a look at the events page, there's actual physical workshops you can take part in that will help build on some of those thinking and principles. But in the meantime, I hope that's been useful. As I said, Sophie's very kindly provided you with a link on the feedback from this. But in the meantime, has anybody got any questions that they would like to ask? Please feel free to put them in the chat box. Will I be sharing the slides? Yes, we will share the slides round. There will also be a recording if you really want to sit through this again, which we'll happily share with you as well. So you can share around if you want to have any information. Okay, so I don't seem to have lots of questions from anybody, which either means you've all been asleep or I've answered everything in my presentation, so I'll take the latter, hopefully. I hope that's been useful for you. As we said, we will send these slides around and I will make sure that the recording's sent to you as well. Look out for events that obviously build on some of the principles I've talked about today. But otherwise, thank you to everybody for attending and enjoy the rest of your lunchtime.